everybody, to another episode of SF Live. This is episode 11. We're joined today by Anthony Milewski. He's the chairman, not the CEO, the chairman of Conic Metals. Also, you're involved in quite a few deals. We're going to talk about all of that in a minute. But first, I just want to remind everybody this is an interactive format. We're here on Twitter. We're live. So please use hashtag AskNKL, short form for nickel. I like it. And to ask your questions during the live stream here. So this is for you. Please make use of that, and we're going to ask all the questions live. So let's switch over to Anthony here. And Anthony, you walked outside because one of the issues here now with the current crisis is Wi-Fi stability and Wi-Fi qualities. You're actually on the 4G or 5G network even.
Yeah, it's crazy, and I apologize, by the way, if any kids run past me in the background or anything. We're all working from home these days, but yeah, it's just another example, right? All the kids are in the place on Zoom trying to do their schoolwork, and so I got better reception going outside on the 5G network than I could inside my house. So just telling times here of the world we're living in.
Where are you right now?
I'm in Southern Washington. I have a place here. I normally live in outside of London, but because of the pandemic, kind of unable to travel.
Okay, so you're actually feeling quite comfortable with Seattle, or the area around Seattle was a hot spot for it.
I'm probably 5 hours from there.
Oh, okay.
If you looked on a map, it would be near like Hood River or White Salmon, Washington. So it's close to sort of there.
Okay. So besides homeschooling your 4 kids, how's your day-to-day changed, like as of late?
Well, I would say initially, obviously, with Conic and some of the deals I'm involved in, I think the first thing you have to focus it on are the employees and the people, making sure everyone's safe. Thinking about protocols and quarantine. So I think, initially all businesses faced that kind of immediately in the aftermath of what was a wave of travel bans. But, once you get past that and then you cancel all your marketing and everything, frankly, you've got a little bit of time on your hands, right? I mean, you can talk to shareholders and I think you can have a lot of time to think about what the world's going to look like in a post-corona world here, whether that's in 2 months or a year, I don't know.
That's actually a good point, and I think something we should hit on a lot because you have a good, like always when we have a conversation, when we meet at conferences, you have a really good macro view of things. One being driven obviously by your involvement in the battery metal space, but also just in general. Just yesterday, and I said that off stream before as well, you posted an article about pork farms closing down in the US, and I think something that caught me off guard is I always thought I have a really good view of things, but then those let's say press articles sort of throw me off because something I didn't think of. So can you put the whole crisis, like the whole pandemic, the whole situation, a bit in context for us? Like, it's still shaping, but what's the world going to look like post COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different angles. And I think just to step back, like the mini crisis of 08 and 09, one of the major kind of results of that crisis was a consolidation of wealth globally, because if you owned financial assets, they appreciated. I think we can all agree. And by the way, that resulted in populist politics globally as well, with Bernie Sanders and Trump to a certain extent as a form of populist politics. And by the way, go to the UK. So fast forward 10 years on, and we have this crisis. And I think one of the major results is going to be U.S. private equity, which has over $1 trillion of dry powder. And, same for the big companies like the Apples of the world. They're going to consolidate their power in an unprecedented way because they have liquidity and they have the ability to access, not only credit, but equity markets. And so I think if we fast forward from now, the consolidation that we saw in 08 and 09 and the wealth accumulation among a very small percentage of people is going to be massively accelerated by the trillions of dollars of printing globally. Remember, we're at almost 35% of the US GDP printed or planned to be printed now. And so that's going to be a major upswing here. And likely a result of that will be further populist politics as people come out of this in the coming years and see once again large companies, big funds, wealthy individuals getting much more wealthier and profiting off of this because of that consolidation. So I think the themes will echo from 08 and 09 and probably transcend this crisis as well and create significant problems, years out. Right now, and it's not intentional. Like, I don't think central bankers around the world are plotting. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I just think there's only so many tools. and you need to be seen to be acting. And those tools really are around monetary policy. And, on the one hand, it does save jobs, but on the other hand, it has a very negative consequence in terms of consolidating global power. And so I think that will be a world we live in fast forward 5 to 6 years after this is all over.
So, scaling it down now, let's look at the mining space. What does that mean for us? Like, obviously, I said before, like, you follow the battery metal space, which to a degree leans over to the base metals as well. You're running Conic, that's a nickel and cobalt royalty company. So you're heavily involved in base metals, and I call nickel the base metals, but cobalt more the battery side. How is that going to reflect on what we're doing right now? Like, what do you see in terms of trends shaping from the current quarantine or self-isolation phase?
Yeah. So I think gold obviously is interesting. I'm not a gold bug, as it were, although I'm very much long some gold names like GDX and GDXJ because it's easy. So I do think that gold as an asset class is not big enough. And just like in 08 and 09, what did people buy? They bought USD. So I don't think gold's going to 20,000 or anything. It's crazy gold bug claims, but I do think it's interesting, and I do think it's worth owning gold names. And just like in 08 and 09, there's likely to be a big spike, but that's a currency really at the end of the day. And so that's something separate and apart from actual physical demand.
You own any Bitcoin?
No, I don't. I've never owned any. It's not been my thing. The one investment I made into an exchange was a disaster. So that was a personal investment. But I think base metals is unique because one of the things that, and this isn't just nickel, this is copper and all the base metal complex. One of the things that governments can do globally, including in China, if you look at and read translations, is they can have infrastructure projects. And so, I think once we get through this, and by the way, that could take a year, could take 18 months. Yeah. Copper, nickel, all these base metals will be interesting because one of the pages from the playbook is going to be big infrastructure projects. And so you could see dramatic spikes. Also, TD does an excellent job of publishing this report. And, there's got kind of something like 208 assets impacted globally, 178 producing, I think was the latest one I saw.
Yeah, Canaccord puts one out as well, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think Scotia, they all do. And they're all kind of, and what's interesting is, so in addition to a wave of stimulus directed at infrastructure spending, which is inevitable, because that's one of the playbooks, you have a situation where, material percentages like 25% of copper has been shut down globally, right, of consumption. Not consumption of supply. And so when that consumption comes back, it may come back much faster due to these projects, then we can ramp back up. So base metals could actually be interesting as well here.
Okay.
Just not today. Just not today. Let's be honest, not today.
Yeah. You're in the US, and I honestly lost a bit track of all the stimulus packages announced. I think there was a snippet in there, a $2 trillion snippet, also for US infrastructure spending. And having been to US airports as of late, there's a huge need of infrastructure spending. Is that a fact? Like, has Trump announced something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now, so interestingly, like when you look at where the pain is, you're looking at right now an unemployment rate of approximately 14% in America. I mean, based on just the numbers of the last 3 weeks, which is, unheard of and already surpasses the 08-09 crisis. So I think what they're trying to do, and checks went out, $1,200 checks went out to every taxpayer in America who made under, I don't know if it was $60,000 or $70,000, and then $500 a kid. So that sort of started going out over the weekend. So I think a lot of the focus has been medium-sized businesses, with the exception of things like airlines and what have you, has really been it's been trying to get money in the hands of average people, because this isn't a liquidity crisis, right? Like when Lehman went under, that was a liquidity crisis. Actually, with the changes in the ratios, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, these banks are liquid and fine. It's individuals, it's someone who has a restaurant, who has a mortgage, and they run the restaurant like their own personal P&L for their restaurant out of their own business, right? Like
they use personal credit cards and stuff as well.
Yes, exactly. So that is the person who's in massive trouble. So, they did shore up the credit markets by buying junk bonds, which is kind of strange that they've done that. But I do think in the latest $2 trillion, it was really aimed at, and let's see if it's effective, at trying to get to actual people. Yeah. Because, by the way, there was big backlash in 08 and 09, bailing out all these companies. And I'll tell you something which you wouldn't have seen, which I think is interesting and smart. So in the Fed's bailout to the airline industry, they put in what are effectively warrants, right? So they said, we're going to give you X amount of money, and then you get a warrant on that. And I just find it deplorable. The airline industry, and there's a big Wall Street Journal article, is pushing back saying, oh, well, we don't want the money if there's a warrant attached to it. I'm like guys, this, Delta's revenue was down 90% in March, 90. And as an industry, you guys are complaining because they're bailing you out and putting a warrant on it. I mean, it's actually insane.
Yeah, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Like, and we've been talking off microphone. You're being based in the US, you see that a lot. Like all the restaurant waitresses and waiters, and they're living day to day. They live off tips, and like once the restaurants are closed, they're not making any money. So I see huge impact, like, and not just tomorrow, but weeks from now in terms of economic impact. Right. And
that's one of the scary things about this crisis is, I mean, it's very possible because, no crisis plays out the same way as the last one. It's very possible that the stock market can continue to rise. I'm not calling that. I'm just saying it's possible with all the stimulus and liquidity. And yet you have massive unemployment and huge socioeconomic problems because, people don't have jobs. The gig economy doesn't work when no one wants to see you. And when you don't have a social network in America like you guys do in Europe, it's a major problem. Healthcare, like I'll give you an example. This will blow your mind. When I'm in the States, okay, so when I'm not in London or in England and I'm in the States, I have to buy health insurance. What do you think that is every single month for not like the luxury plan? What do you think it is?
It's got to be like $1,000 or something.
$1,800. By the way, you still, when you go to the doctor, you still have to pay them money. And you still get a bill. I mean, this is crazy. And so I use that as an example only to say that, I'm fortunate enough to be able to pay that. But there are a tremendous number of Americans who have lost their jobs. Something like,
was it
14 or
16 million or something I saw today?
Yes, I think approaching 17 million. And, the furloughs are still going. So it's not going to stop, right? And like, this is the problem. And so this is the confusion and why it's slightly different. In 08 and 09, like not that many people lost their job, actually.
Yeah.
It was different. And, that's where the V curve, the V recovery, I think is called into question, is because, are these jobs going to come back? I'll tell you, I have a friend who's in the retail business, and he was kind of telling me about their projections. And, his view is that demand for their products, it might take 12 months for it to come back. Even if we're out of quarantine by July, people aren't going to just go start spending money. You're going to feel like, man, we better skip that purchase, and that's for clothing and shoes. What about for cars? I mean, do you really need to buy a car this year?
No, I've been going on Lease Busters, just waiting for people's leases to go up there, and so I can take over a lease for cheap. Right. So, but I think we're going to see that more. Let's circle back. We talked about battery metals, and that's obviously where you come from, and Conic Metals comes in. So let's circle back there for a minute. So you've been always a big advocate of battery metals, nickel, cobalt. Why haven't we seen that, let's say, conversion to more battery focused? Like we've had that conversation. I used to work with a graphite company 5 years ago, and all we were saying, like, oh, let's just wait till home storage comes in. And we haven't seen that really pick up. Everybody's been focused on EVs, but nothing else has really happened. Can you give us an update on that? Like, what's the market looking like there? And why has cobalt dropped? Why has lithium dropped? Like, what's going on there?
I mean, let's just call a spade a spade. Like, automobile sales have plummeted. I mean, like no one anywhere in the world is buying automobile. So that's automobile sales in general, which actually means, of course, EV sales have plummeted, right? So that's not a reflection of people's willingness or desire to adopt EVs. It's just a reflection of, guess what, you lost your job. You're not buying any car, let alone an EV, right? Yeah. So I think that's part of the story. The other part, which I think is going to be very positive on the backside of this, is, and I'm sure you've seen them, like there's towns in India where they're seeing the Himalayas for the first time in 30 years. Yeah. Pollution in some cities in China is like back to 1960s levels. So I think people are going to get a whiff, as it were, of clean air in some of these places and realize that actually, this is great. And so I think it actually helps the adoption and even acceleration of EV sales. However, we have to get through this first. And if you don't need a new car, like, why would you go buy a car right now, right? If you're worried about your job, it just doesn't make any sense. So that has a knock-on effect of impacting lithium, nickel, cobalt, in so much as that's part of the overall demand picture for a given commodity.
Yeah, cool. No, so we've covered a lot of bases, and it's always widely interesting to talk to you about the macro side of things. But one thing I want to do here is also talk about questions the Twitter users have. So let's switch over to Twitter. Let's see what's going on over there. And we've got a couple questions in, or people... And we've changed the format just a little bit. I switched from Tweet Alert. Now we're just window capturing what's going on Twitter. But we had a couple questions come in. They're just underneath our announcement here. And one of the things is, like, you're also involved with Giga Metals, Conic as a shareholder. I think it's 9% that you own, 7 or 9% that Conic owns of Giga. Maybe you can give us a quick update on that as well.
Yeah, so and I personally have purchased in the market, I can't remember if it's 5% of Giga as well. Something like that. What I would say is it's one of the largest undeveloped nickel sulfide projects on Earth, right? And if we look back at the past kind of 20 years, one of the great ways to destroy value in mining has been building an HPAL facility, right? Like, look at Goro, look at Ravensthorpe, look at Embatavi.
Hold on. What's HPAL for our listeners?
High pressure acid leach.
Okay.
So it's a way of processing a laterite ore body.
Okay.
And the laterite, a lot of the nickel projects globally, like Embatavi, Ravensthorpe, are, they are these laterite deposits. And what happened was, management teams promised $1 billion capex, $2 billion capex, and some of them ended up at $8 billion. So what that means is, and it's because the processing is technologically challenging, and a lot of times they're in places that are hard to operate in. And so, what that means is the next wave of projects to develop globally will probably be either expansions of currently producing, HPAL facilities, which is fine because it's already producing, or it will be nickel sulfide projects. And, there's a couple. One is called Dumont in Canada. There's, some in Russia and a few in Australia. And then there's, of course, Turnagain in Canada. And the reason I like it is because it's a massive ore body. It's low grade, but the concentrate that they can make is something like a 24% nickel con, and so it's an option. When the nickel story happens, this thing is going to be worth huge amounts of money in my view, and when you can buy like an option at this price, is amazing. So you bought it personally. We're there. We've got a royalty on it. It's really interesting. Now it's not gonna. Let's be clear. Like, if the world is blowing up, like, it's not going up. Nothing is.
Well, right? Then we have other problems anyway. So
yeah.
That's the other thing. And another question. It's a bit controversial one, but I'd actually like to have your opinion on it. And it's not a question; it's more of a statement almost. But he ended it with a question mark. So didn't we learn a lesson from Cobalt 27 yet? Which is interesting, because what did you learn from it? And there are some ramifications. And like, Conic is a development, is a spin out from Cobalt 27 and what happened there. But what are the lessons we learned from that?
I mean, it's a really challenging thing, right? Because ultimately these things all go to shareholder votes. I couldn't vote, and it passed overwhelmingly, right? Like, it overwhelmingly passed. I think you have to kind of understand that whenever you're buying a commodity company, a mining company, an exploration company, that business is going to be driven by the commodity, whether that's nickel or lithium or cobalt. And, in Cobalt 27, it worked really well on the way up. But when the commodity rolled over for a variety of reasons, it just did not work as well. And, at the bottom, shareholders decided to sell it, and they could have bid it up, and they didn't. And so I think the lesson is to just really think through those commodity cycles and what the implications are on a particular business, because when that commodity is down and out, there's not a lot you can do as a management team if the shareholders want to sell the business.
That's true. So, but what did you learn from Conic? Like, did you set up Conic differently, or what's the plan with Conic now? What's the lesson you learned there?
I think with Conic, I'll tell you something interesting, and you'll like this. And what I would say is the stickiest shareholders are retail. So that was that was a major learning. Like, I had not, you name these big funds, and you think, oh, like, these are the big shareholders that you want. It's actually not true. All of those funds are paid annually, every single one of them, and like, they're marked for the years, how they get paid, how they have a job or don't have a job. But the number of people that I talk to who bought the stock and were happy to sit through it, who were just individual folks who had a couple $1,000s worth of stock. I mean, that was a really powerful lesson. And the sticky money is actually retail, and that's completely underappreciated by the market. And I don't know what you can do about that because people buy and sell your stock. But I think one of the things you can do is spend more time marketing to retail and creating a strong retail following versus, getting a BlackRock or a Fidelity to buy your stock, which is also important. But it's a very different and impersonal thing because a fund manager, like at a pod place, like a Millennium or Citadel, he or she can just be told to sell. Like, the market's down, you're selling today. Someone's individual $1,000, guess what? Like, they can buy or sell. Yeah. And so I think if you talk about just general takeaways, that this notion of retail being having a far longer view than pension funds, than hedge funds, for sure, private equity funds is really true.
One thing, actually, and you told me that, is when you raised money for Cobalt 27, you saw a lot of generalist interest, which I thought, okay, great, the battery metal space is finally attracting another audience to the sector again, to the mining sector in general, not just precious metals, but mining in general. Do we see that happening now? Like with post-COVID, I hear like more pension funds are calling now the gold companies. One thing I was hoping for secretly was that we actually did see a bit of a crash in the Dow Jones and S&P so that the 401k money would get nervous and would have to reallocate some of their funds. And now that they lost 20% or 25%, I haven't looked at the latest numbers yet, are they going to come back into a riskier business like mining to make up for those losses?
Yeah, so I think... GDX, right? Big liquid name where, it's actually an ETF, but the underpinning gold companies, I think they do and will continue to see inflows. But I don't believe that the majority of pension funds are that interested in the junior mining space, primarily because remember, after 2008, 2009, the structure of all these funds changed. In addition to the rise of passive, and passive, just doesn't buy or sell. They're working on an algorithm. You had the hedge funds have all these requirements enter around liquidity. You have to trade this much percentage a day, and you have to be able to close your position out within 2 business days, and you can't know more than the average daily volume of 2 weeks, and all this sort of stuff. And so, what that has done is made it extremely challenging for miners. And so, what I think happens is look at marijuana, in a lot of ways similar, right? But then this flood of retail came in and carried the liquidity to a point where funds could start to enter. And so you're going to need an event, and that event might be stimulus coupled with, shutdowns that really drives commodity prices hard, for base metals at least. Something like that to bring retail in a big way, and then hopefully drag in the generalists. The other part that people don't talk about, and it's really important, is, I started my career at a hedge fund that invested in commodities and didn't have constraints around liquidity. That fund doesn't exist anymore. Neither do the funds like Rab Capital, not in any material way, exist. And instead, all that money has drifted into the Orions and Sentia, the 10 different... Equity. Yeah, private equity or the streaming and royalty model. But what the market sort of where it falls over is none of that works if you don't have equity, right? Like, you actually fundamentally need equity for streams and royalties. Yeah. And so the allocators of assets who used to allocate to hedge funds have over allocated to this quasi debt strategy without allocating to people who give capital to the equity markets. And so it's kind of this cycle. And, I don't know if we're at the tail of it, but certainly it will have to come around, because eventually if you starve an industry long enough, you will have big swings in prices.
So sort of to wrap this up, we've already been talking for 25 minutes roughly. So that's sort of the format we're looking for. Like, how is Anthony Milewski investing his money right now, personally?
So personally, I'm mostly in treasuries, with the exception of GDX, GDXJ. I kind of think that the earnings season is going to be awful, and there's going to be another sell-off in the broader markets. And at that point, might enter some of the big liquid S&P kind of names. But in the mining space specifically, I think gold right now is probably the most interesting place to be, except for really specific names that that you can pick up cheap as they sell off. Yeah.
So cool. Anthony, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for stepping outside and improving the quality. I really appreciate it. It's actually, I like the background. You got the ravens and the crows flying through it. It's quite neat. Good luck in Washington there. Stay safe. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks a lot, bud.